Hello and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining today. Today it's a joyful occasion of Albert Einstein's birthday. He's a world-renowned genius. Today we stand on the shoulders of giants like Albert Einstein for our progress. At the outset, I'd like to thank our event partner, Mr. Annam Tyagaraja Kishore, CEO, Vidyasangha Technologies Private Limited. For any queries, please feel free to contact us at india@valstech.com. Now, we are delighted to have Mr. Eric Murrell, Director of Ecosystem Development at Open Networking Foundation, also known as ONF. Thank you, sir. We are delighted to listen to you. Thank you.
As we gather around Einstein's birthday, I want to thank you for the invitation to speak around open source. For those that may not be aware, I am with the Open Networking Foundation, or ONF. At ONF, our mission is to transform the industry by using open source, disaggregation, and white boxes. This construct enables networks to come together as cost-effectively and efficiently as possible. The cornerstone of all of this is open source. As a result, I will spend the next period of time discussing this topic. In fact, the title of my discussion is A Good Start Today? In other words, are the attributes of open source and the underlying benefits still a good place for software development to begin? Let's dig into this to determine the answer. But before I do, I want to jump right to the end and say, yes, I believe it does. However, we will trace the concept to its origins, at least as far as I can tell, and work our way forward. Before we can conduct an appropriate analysis on whether open source remains a viable place to begin developmental projects, we should understand how the concept began. The concept of free sharing of technical information began long before computers. In the early days of the automobile, one enterprise owned the rights to a two-cycle gas engine patent. It was originally filed by George Selden. By controlling this patent, George and some of his associates were able to monopolize the industry and require automobile manufacturers to adhere to their requirements or risk litigation. Henry Ford successfully challenged this in court, and a new association, which would eventually be called the Motor Vehicle Manufacturers Association, would form. This association instituted a cross-licensing agreement among all U.S. auto manufacturers. While each company would develop technology and file patents, they were openly shared without the exchange of money. And by the time that the United States entered World War II, over 500 patents were filed and the underlying technology was shared between the companies without an exchange of money. So you see, the concept of sharing of certain technology without the exchange of money began a long time ago, well before the modern electronic age, or the digital age. Now, in the 50s and 60s, most software was produced collaboratively and often shared as public domain software. Most of the distribution was under the principles of openness and cooperation, which was the norm of the day. This gave life to the hacking culture, which initially had a positive connotation among open programmers. This is because of the intellectual challenge of creatively overcoming the challenges of software systems to achieve novel and clever outcomes. Source code was generally distributed with machine code because users frequently modified the software themselves, as it wouldn't run on different hardware or operating systems without modification, and to fix bugs or to add new capabilities. And as far as I can tell, the first example of free and open source software is the A2 system, which was developed in 1953 at the UNIVAC division of Remington Rand. It was released with the source code included. At that time, most IBM software was distributed with source code included. User groups for both IBM and DEC were formed to facilitate the exchange of software. The Share operating system, originally developed by General Motors, was distributed for the IBM 709 and 7090 computers. And in the late 1960s, ARPANET, a transcontinental high-speed computer network, was conceived and constructed. This network made it easy to exchange software. Now, lest we think that open source pertains only to operating systems, later in the 1970s, there was a free application development called SPICE, or Simulation Program with Integrated Circuit Emphasis. This is helpful in designing the integrity of circuit designs. Now, that was in fact in use in the early 80s when I was an undergraduate. What I want to share is that while there was a sense of sharing of the software during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even early 80s, it wasn't construed as open source because there wasn't a specific community around developing software as a platform the way you see open source design today. In the modern era, there was an analysis done called the Cathedral and Bazaar. It's a reflective analysis of the hacker community and probably the most significant factor in Netscape releasing their popular Netscape Communicator Internet Suite as freeware. The central thesis of the analysis is that given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. As a result, the more widely available any source code is for public scrutiny and testing, the more rapidly all forms of bugs will be discovered and remediated. Now, by contrast, in the Cathedral model, an inordinate amount of time and energy is used in locating and remediating bugs. While the term free software had been in use for some time, the term open source began to gain wide acceptance at the Free Software Strategy session in Palo Alto, California. This session took place as a reaction to source code being released with Netscape's Navigator product. There are a number of use cases for companies large and small using open source. There are 10 that I want to pick on because they're begging to be utilized. I'll discuss each one in relative detail. Server software is first. Apache is one of the most widely used web server software platforms on the planet, and it's free, reliable, easy to manage, and doesn't require the enormous overhead needed for Internet Information Services. If you need SMB sharing across your company, consider Samba. Samba version 4.0 integrates with Active Directory so you don't have to worry about setting up separate user accounts on the Samba server. From a development point of view, developing with open source is a no-brainer. PHP, Rails, Perl. There are as many languages to develop with as there are tools. There are a lot of options for developing for open source or with open source tools. The biggest difference between open source and proprietary is the access you have to the code. Within the world of free open source software systems, the code is readily available. For many developers, the Linux operating system has everything they need to develop built right in. If you require GUI development tools, open source has you covered. From a security point of view, the route to security is a challenging one, but there are many paths to success. You can opt for the security in a box solution and go with the likes of Cisco, or you can craft your security to perfectly fit your needs with the likes of IP tables. Yes, the open source security route will take a bit more time to deploy, but the end results are generally incredible. This doesn't even address the idea that using open source on the desktop is, well, generally speaking, a more secure platform than most proprietary systems. Deploy Linux on the desktop and your security woes will drop dramatically. In desktops, this area is where most of the pushback takes place because of the popularity of Windows and even Apple's iOS. However, you must take into consideration the fact that the daily workflow has undergone a major paradigm shift. Most of what we do now is done via a web browser, so why not deploy Linux on the desktop? Not only does it work with the majority of today's tasks, it will do so without the maladies from viruses, malware, and updates that cripple a system. While it's not perfect, nothing is, it is solid, and in the end, can save you money. That's what we call a win-win. From a workflow point of view, every enterprise depends on workflow. For some businesses, a smooth workflow depends on tools. And open source has this arena covered. CRM, HRM, ERP, BI, BPM, you name it. Open source handles just about every possible acronym you can think of, and it does it very well. With the likes of Pentaho, Collabtive, and Sugar CRM, open source can keep up with closed source tools rather well. From a collaboration point of view, without the ability to work together on projects, your staff can get the job done. They can't get the job done. So, the collaboration tools you choose are crucial. You'll find plenty of quality collaboration tools within the world of open source. CYN.IN, Community Edition, Zimbra Open Source Edition, and Colab are just 3 examples of the excellent collaboration tools that exist within the open source world. Looking at big data. When it comes to big data, open source can't be matched. Thanks to the like of SUSE, big data and open source now go hand in hand. Innovations like in-memory data and live kernel patching make open source an ideal solution for big data. It can be perfectly tuned to meet the massive demands big data places on the platform. Closed source software can't touch this level of flexibility. In the cloud, major players in the cloud are open source. Red Hat, Ubuntu, SUSE, Amazon, Rackspace, they all get it and know that open source is the best solution for cloud deployments. Don't worry, there are still some up-and-comers like OwnCloud where you can either take advantage of its hosted cloud solutions or build your own. From a multimedia point of view, if you need podcasting or video for public relations, open source can help you. There are tools like Audacity and OpenShot that enable you to do whatever you need and do it cost effectively. And finally, e-commerce. If you have an online showcase, you need to try PrestaShop. It's one of the most powerful e-commerce solutions available, regardless of license. It's feature-rich and a platform that excels at e-commerce on every level. So, now that we understand some of the use cases, how do we go forward? Should you integrate open source in your company? Can you identify some tangible benefits for doing so? Is the risk associated with using open source mitigatable? How do you do that? Well, let's look at this from the perspective of the various attributes that are required to make open source successful. First, there's the community. The community benefits from the advantage of having more eyes on the solution. The more eyes that are on the solution, the better it will become. You can benefit by the power of the community as you move forward with open source. The crowd. The crowd exponentially gets more eyes on the problem, and the more eyes on the problem, the more powerful the outcome. The collective power of the crowd of talented individuals working together deliver not only more ideas, but quicker development and problem resolution. And this is critical to moving forward with open source. Transparency. Open source code means just that. You have full visibility into the code base and all discussions the community has around it. This extends to problem identification and resolution, and by contrast, closed code produced behind a wall may come with unforeseen limitations and other surprises. With open source, there's no surprises. You see exactly what you're going to get. From a security point of view, open source code is generally more secure because more eyes have been on it. The additional scrutiny the community around a solution is placed tends to significantly increase the robustness and secure nature of it. More eyes means more evaluation, which means more holes found and more holes plugged. Open source is merit-based. With open source code, the only motivation behind decisions made is the solution itself. As a result, personalities and other issues, even commercial issues, go out the window using open source. Time to market. Because of the community around open source code, the time to market is most often shortened. This also has the collateral benefit of enabling the host company to focus more of their effort on moving up what I call the value chain, where their differentiation will lay. This is enhanced features and functionality associated with the platform. That's where companies should focus their energy. Open source is cost effective. Having a total solution that's largely based on open source by default means that it's more cost effective than closed proprietary solutions, and it can easily be extended, and that lends to the cost advantage as well. Control. One of the biggest reasons to consider open source is to control your own destiny and remove the single vendor lock-in that can occur with closed proprietary solutions. Freedom to move in any direction your company needs to, and the timing associated with it and every decision around it enables you to hold on to the control you desperately need. And finally, catching up. The entire industry is moving towards open source than away, and the sooner you do too, the more you can enable your overall business model to benefit from doing so. Additionally, the long-term viability associated with open source far exceeds closed systems. You aren't always sure where things will be and when they will be. So the sooner you jump on board, the better off you are. Now, one of the things that's important in developing a sound open source strategy is the understanding the underlying benefits and parts of it. You have to maximize the community. And to maximize the community, you have to focus on the two separate audiences that are associated with it. There's the beneficiaries or the consumers of open source and the beneficients or the producers of open source software. Each one of these communities needs to be addressed separately from a focus point of view and from an outreach and marketing perspective. Now, what are the useful elements for the community around open source? The objective of the company supporting the open source is to make sure that the community around it and its various platforms have a number of useful elements in them. Specifically, the company must provide or ensure the following: that there's a community around it. It should be effective marketing and outreach campaigns to get as many eyeballs on a platform as possible. The documentation for each platform should be useful and readable so that participants can get engaged quickly and make meaningful impact on the problem. The goal for each platform is to operate in a stable manner. For this to happen, realizing the promise of the shallow bugs must take place. The repository the code is stored in should be open to the community around the problem or around the platform, and effective safeguards should be in place to prevent the code from getting corrupted or surreptitiously modified. And once the platform is mature, it should be shared openly with the community at large so positive impact can be realized thereby. Open source provides the best path forward to breaking through the iron triangle. Most everyone would like to not have to compromise here. Clearly, the objective is always to have amazing quality, quickly, with the lowest effective cost available. No other method of software development can come close to achieving this holy grail. Now what I want to do is share some interesting statistics with you based on a survey that was recently conducted. This survey was a collaboration between OpenLogic and OSI, and it took place from November of last year through January of this year, and a couple of attributes of the survey need noticing. First, it was a global survey covering all industries, and there are a couple of key takeaways that I want to point to. First, when asking what the use of open source is last year relative to the years before, an astonishing 77% of respondents report that they use open source and they will significantly continue to use open source going forward. And the suggestion here is that there is quite a runway for open source from a development point of view. And if you want to make sure that your solution sets are efficient and as cost effective as possible, they should include a healthy dose of open source. Next, what are the types of open source software used? And overwhelmingly, you see a number of frameworks and tools associated with open source usage. Various languages, frameworks, tooling, and the like are included at a high percentage rate of respondents to this survey. And then the third thing I want to draw your attention to are the concerns that people articulate around using open source. You see, none of these are that predominant. As a matter of fact, that in the highest of cases, it's only 30% of respondents say that skill shortage is a concern that they have. But what I like to point to are the almost 30% of respondents that say they have absolutely no concerns whatsoever about using open source. And what it tells me is that people understand the value of open source, and by understanding the value of open source, there's a high degree of interest in moving forward with it. And the last one I want to point to are the reasons that people articulate to use open source. And almost half of the respondents say that they want to have access to the latest and greatest in software development. This is really important. What it suggests is that people want to be on the leading edge so that they can take advantage of the best thinking around. They also appreciate the economics associated with using open source in as much as the cost of developing solutions is concerned. And they understand that it improves the development velocity. And so what we're saying is that breaking through the iron triangle is a reality by simply employing the use of open source. So summarily, what are we saying? Open source software has cemented its role as a critical technology agenda driver for companies. However, too few firms take the necessary steps to optimize their strategies around open source. They need to develop an open source strategy with a policy for communicating its usage and contributions. It's critical that brands also align their strategies to incorporate critical services like support, training, education, and consulting to drive their benefits. Without a comprehensive and optimized strategies that govern the critical pillars of running open source software, organizations risk missing out on the benefits they can deliver, including greater flexibility and better efficiency, time to market for products, and consumer and employee experiences, and more. I want to take the time now to thank you for your attention, and I hope this has been helpful as you consider using open source in your own development processes.